I did not go into the Pacific Northwest chasing legends. I went because men were walking away from their wages, because saws were left running in the dirt, because a logging camp that should have lasted decades was quietly falling apart from the inside. It was 1927 when I first noticed the silence. Not the calm kind, but the kind that feels arranged, as if the forest itself was listening. No birds, no insects. Just the sense that whatever lived beyond the tree line was waiting for us to move first. We were not careless men. We worked with steel and timber. We understood accidents. We understood death. But what began happening at that camp did not follow any rule we knew. Footsteps circled the site at night and then stopped. Breathing came from the dark, slow and controlled, too deliberate to belong to any animal. Then men stopped coming back, not torn apart, not dragged away screaming. They simply vanished, and when one of them was found days later, his body told a story no one wanted to finish out loud. Bones crushed, no tracks leading away, no sign of a struggle that made sense. I am telling you this because I survived, and because every man who left that camp swore the same thing. What killed our co-workers was not human. If you are listening to this, stay with the story. Do not skip ahead. And if you believe there are still places where something older than us decides who belongs in the woods and who does not, subscribe now and leave a comment. Stories like this disappear when no one is willing to hear them, because whatever was watching us back then never needed to chase us. It already knew where we slept. The camp had been built in a narrow basin between two ridge lines where the trees grew so close together that daylight arrived late and left early. And even before anything happened, there was always the sense that we were working inside something that could close itself at will. Because sound did not travel the way it should, and wind never moved through evenly, as if the forest decided which noises were allowed to escape and which were meant to stay trapped with us. I was responsible for inventory and shift rotations, which meant I noticed patterns long before anyone else did. And the first pattern was not violence or fear, but hesitation. Men standing longer at the edge of the tree line before stepping into it. Men glancing back toward camp, as if expecting something to follow. Men volunteering for day shifts and inventing excuses when night rotations were posted. All of it subtle enough that no one challenged it directly, but heavy enough that it sat on us like wet wool. The first man we lost was named Harold Muir, a quiet cutter with a bad knee who never wandered far from his assigned section, and when he did not report back at dusk, we assumed he had taken shelter or injured himself and would limp in by morning. But morning came clean and bright, and he did not. And when we followed his marked trail, we found his saw still embedded in a half-cut trunk, the engine cold, the chain untouched, and the ground around it undisturbed except for a single deep impression pressed into the mud nearby that looked less like a footprint and more like the bottom of a post driven straight down. We searched until dark and found nothing, and when we returned to camp, the forest seemed closer than it had that morning, the ridgelines pressing inward, the trees leaning just enough to make it feel like we were being funneled toward the center. And that night, no one slept, because whatever moved beyond the firelight did not rush or snap branches or announce itself the way animals do, but shifted slowly, deliberately, circling us with a patience that felt learned. Over the next days, the camp began to change in ways that had nothing to do with missing men and everything to do with behavior, because food was left untouched, tools were stacked too neatly, as if someone had tried to impose order where none was needed. And more than once, I woke before dawn to the sense that I was being watched from above, not from the ground, but from somewhere higher in the trees where the branches thickened and the shadows layered. When we finally found Harold, it was not where any of us expected, because his body lay less than half a mile from camp in a clearing we crossed daily, placed on its back with no sign of scavenging and no sign of a struggle. His chest crushed inward as if something had pressed down slowly rather than struck, his arms bent at odd angles, his face intact but slack, as though fear had never reached it in time. No one said the word then, but we all thought it, because there are injuries that come from accidents and injuries that come from animals, and then there are injuries that come from something that understands where to apply pressure. That was when the forest stopped feeling empty and began to feel occupied after Harold was buried, not deep but hurried, because none of us wanted to stay exposed longer than necessary. The camp settled into a tense routine where no one traveled alone, and every shift ended early enough to keep us inside the firelight before full dark. Yet even with those precautions, the feeling did not lift, because whatever had done this did not act like a predator competing for territory, but like something enforcing boundaries we had crossed without permission. At night, I began hearing movement, not in the brush but above it, the slow transfer of weight through branches too thick to sway easily. And once when I looked up, I saw the canopy bend slightly without sound, as if something heavy had crouched there and adjusted itself to watch us better. And in that moment I understood that height mattered, that whatever this was preferred vantage over pursuit. The second man to die was not careless or alone, but stationed with 2 others on perimeter watch. And when they came running back toward camp just before dawn, breathless and pale, they spoke over each other until their words tangled, describing how the forest ahead of them had simply stopped, how every sound had cut off at once, how something had stepped into view without emerging, as if it had already been standing there the entire time, waiting for them to notice. They said it was tall, but not thin, that its shoulders rose higher than a man could reach, and its outline did not break against the trees because it matched them too well. And before either of them could raise a rifle, the thing had moved, not fast but certain, closing distance in a way that made running feel pointless. And when it struck the third man, there was no roar, no frenzy, only the sound of weight meeting resistance and winning. We found what was left of him near the watch line, his body intact but ruined internally, ribs driven inward, spine compressed, organs displaced in a way that suggested sustained pressure rather than impact. And around him the ground bore those same deep impressions, not scattered, not hurried, but placed with intention, as if whatever stood there had not needed to rush or adjust. That morning several men packed their things without speaking and left down the trail, and none of us tried to stop them, because by then we all knew the truth that had been circling us since the first night, that we were not being hunted randomly, but evaluated, measured, tested, and found wanting. What frightened me most was not the deaths but the restraint, the sense that this thing could have done more at any time, could have come into camp, could have torn through us while we slept, but chose instead to act selectively, as though teaching us something slowly, patiently, the way you teach animals to avoid a place by showing them consequences. By the end of that week, every man who remained swore the same thing in private, even if none of us said it aloud together, that what walked those woods was not an animal and not a story, but something that had always been there, something that did not need to chase us, because it already knew exactly how long we would stay. By the end of the second week, the camp no longer followed any recognizable rhythm, because time itself seemed to distort once the sun slipped behind the ridgelines, and men who had spent their lives measuring days by output and weather now measured them by proximity to darkness, counting hours until nightfall with the same quiet dread you might reserve for an incoming storm you cannot outrun. I began to notice that whatever watched us did not react to noise in the way animals do, because shouting did nothing, and machinery did nothing, and even gunshots fired into the trees produced no scramble or retreat, only a deeper silence afterward, the kind that settles heavier than before, as though the sound had been absorbed rather than answered. And that realization changed the way we moved, because it suggested intelligence, patience, and an understanding of cause and effect. One afternoon I followed a fresh set of impressions that had appeared near the eastern boundary, not tracks exactly but depressions, wide and deep and evenly spaced, as if something had stood upright and shifted its weight deliberately while observing the camp. And when I traced them uphill, I noticed how the trees ahead bent slightly inward, forming a natural corridor that funneled sightlines downward toward our clearing, a place where anything standing there could watch without being seen. Standing in that corridor, I felt something settle over me, not panic but certainty. The certainty that I was not alone and never had been, and that whatever occupied this place had known about us long before the first tree fell, had understood our routines before we understood our vulnerability, and had allowed us to stay only because we had not yet crossed whatever line mattered. That night a storm moved through, heavy rain hammering the roofs and turning the ground slick, and I remember thinking that rain should have erased tracks and softened sounds, should have given us cover, but instead it seemed to sharpen everything, because movement carried farther and the darkness felt thicker, layered, as though depth itself had increased. Sometime after midnight a scream cut through the rain, abrupt and unfinished, and by the time we reached the northern watch point we found only a lantern still burning on the ground, its glass intact, its flame steady despite the weather, and nearby the body of a man who had been alive minutes earlier, his limbs slack, his torso collapsed inward, his expression blank, as though whatever had done this had not needed to frighten him first. No one argued after that. At dawn the foreman announced we would begin dismantling the camp, and there was relief in that decision mixed with something darker, because leaving did not feel like retreat, but like compliance, like acknowledging a verdict already passed. And as we packed our equipment I noticed how the forest seemed to relax, how birds returned cautiously, how the pressure eased just enough to suggest approval. That was when I understood that we were not victims of chance or misfortune, but participants in a process we did not control. The morning we prepared to leave the camp the air felt different, not lighter exactly, but less restrained, as though whatever force had held itself in check was now watching out of obligation rather than intent, and men moved through their tasks quietly, dismantling structures that had taken months to raise, knowing with a certainty none of us spoke aloud that staying even one more night would invite consequences we could no longer survive. I was assigned to inventory the final supplies at the edge of the clearing, and as I worked I became acutely aware of the space beyond the tree line, not because I saw movement, but because the absence of it felt deliberate, as if something massive and patient stood just out of sight, choosing restraint now that our decision had been made. At one point I found myself alone near the southern trailhead, holding a ledger I no longer needed, listening to the distant sounds of men loading wagons, and for a moment I hesitated, caught between the safety of the group and the pull of unanswered questions, because part of me wanted to know how close it really was, whether I could see it if I stood still long enough, whether the fear that had governed our days had a shape I could recognize. It was then that I stopped and asked myself what choice I would make if I truly believed something stronger than me was deciding whether I deserved to leave alive. And I wonder now what you would have done in that same position, standing alone with the forest watching, knowing that curiosity and survival rarely point in the same direction. And if you feel compelled to answer that question, you can leave your thoughts in the comments, because every man who survived that place carried his own version of that decision for the rest of his life. I chose to turn back. As we pulled away from the camp, wagons creaking under the weight of our departure, I looked back one last time and saw movement not in the clearing but high along the ridge line, a broad silhouette shifting against the trees, upright and still, watching without pursuit. And in that moment I understood that mercy, when it comes from something powerful, does not feel like kindness, but like permission. No one followed us. The trail out felt longer than the journey in, as though the forest itself stretched distance to ensure we did not change our minds. And when we finally reached open ground and the trees thinned, the men began to speak again, not about what we had seen, but about where we would go next. Because survival often demands silence about the reasons behind it. I never returned to that region, but I know others tried, because rumors followed us into towns and rail camps and offices, whispers of abandoned equipment and crushed bodies and loggers who swore they had seen something that should not exist. And every time those stories surfaced they were dismissed the same way, with laughter and certainty, and the assurance that men imagine monsters when they are afraid. But I was there. And some places do not need to chase you to prove they are dangerous. Leaving the basin did not end the story, because whatever we had stepped away from did not remain neatly behind us. And in the weeks that followed, I learned that distance does not always weaken fear, but can refine it, stripping away noise until only the memory remains, sharp and persistent, resurfacing at the quietest moments when you least expect it. The men scattered quickly after we reached the railhead, some heading east, others south, each of us carrying a private version of what had happened, and although we agreed not to speak openly, silence proved impossible to maintain, because the body remembers what the mouth refuses to shape, and sooner or later something slipped out in a tavern, a boarding house, a supply office, always framed as rumor, always softened just enough to be dismissed. I took work as a clerk for a timber firm several counties away, thinking that paper and ledgers might anchor me to something orderly and predictable. But even there, the forest followed, because shipments arrived late with no explanation. Camps reported unexplained losses, and every so often a foreman would lower his voice and mention a site that had gone quiet without warning, as though a pattern was forming that only those who had lived inside it could recognize. At night, I dreamed of elevation, of looking down into clearings from heights that made my stomach tighten, and I would wake with the sensation of having stood somewhere I did not belong, of having been allowed to observe rather than participate, and those dreams carried with them a peculiar calm that frightened me more than the nightmares ever had, because calm suggests understanding, and understanding implies alignment. One evening, months after we abandoned the camp, I encountered one of the men who had fled early, his face thinner, his eyes restless, and when we spoke it became clear that he too had tried to outrun what we had witnessed, moving repeatedly, changing names, avoiding forests whenever possible, yet still waking to the same impressions pressed into his thoughts, wide and deep and evenly spaced, as if something followed not by footsteps but by memory. He told me that what unsettled him most was not the violence but the restraint, the sense that whatever had killed those men could have done far worse, could have erased us completely, but chose instead to demonstrate capability and then wait for a response, like a warning delivered once and never repeated. And that realization had hollowed him out, because warnings only matter if the one receiving them is expected to understand. As he spoke, I realized that we had never truly left the basin, because it had entered us, reshaping how we interpreted absence and pressure and silence, turning ordinary woods into potential thresholds. And when we parted, Fawn felt a tightening in my chest, not of fear but of recognition, the understanding that this thing did not need proximity to maintain influence, because it had already rewritten our sense of safety. From that night on, I stopped pretending that what happened belonged to the past and began to accept that survival sometimes carries a cost measured not in injury but in awareness, because once you have learned how little separates the ordinary from the occupied, you never walk through trees the same way again. Years passed, and with time came the temptation to frame the events of 1927 as an anomaly, a convergence of stress and isolation and coincidence amplified by fear. But that explanation never fully settled, because every attempt to rationalize what happened left something unresolved, a remainder that refused to be accounted for, and it was in that remainder that the truth persisted. I followed reports quietly, scanning trade bulletins and regional newspapers for familiar language, for mentions of camps shutting down abruptly or bodies found without external wounds. And while most accounts were vague and inconclusive, there were enough similarities to suggest continuity, enough echoes to imply that what we encountered was not unique, but episodic, emerging only when certain conditions were met. What those conditions were I cannot say with certainty, but I suspect they had less to do with noise or intrusion, and more to do with persistence, with the slow accumulation of presence, because the camp had not been attacked immediately, and neither had others, as though something watched first, assessed, and only acted when a threshold was crossed that we could not perceive. I began corresponding with a naturalist who had cataloged unexplained disappearances along remote timber routes, and although he framed his work cautiously, his questions betrayed an awareness that extended beyond animals and accidents, and in one letter, he asked whether I believed there were forms of intelligence that do not require tools or language to exert control, an idea that unsettled me because it mirrored what I had felt in the basin without ever articulating. As I aged, the dreams shifted, becoming less vivid but more instructive, replacing fear with a sense of orientation, as though I were being reminded of boundaries rather than threatened with consequences, and I came to believe that the experience had not been meant to destroy us but to mark us, to ensure that some knowledge survived intact even as the physical evidence faded. I no longer think of what we encountered as a creature in the way stories prefer, because that word implies randomness and hunger, and what I witnessed felt neither random nor hungry, but deliberate, constrained, operating according to principles that did not require our understanding to remain effective. When people ask why certain regions resist settlement, despite resources and opportunity, I think of the basin and the way the forest seemed to close ranks around it. And I understand that not all land is vacant, simply because it appears unoccupied, and not all warnings arrive in forms we are willing to recognize. I have told this story now, not to convince, but to record, because forgetting serves only those forces that benefit from our certainty. And if what happened in that camp was an assertion rather than an attack, then the most dangerous mistake would be assuming it was isolated. Some places endure not because they are empty, but because they are claimed. I had convinced myself for years that time would dull the edges of what we experienced, that distance would reduce it to a story I could tell without feeling the forest close in around me. But that belief collapsed the moment I received a letter from a forestry office several states north, written in careful language that tried very hard not to say what it meant, describing a remote logging operation that had gone silent after a series of unexplained incidents that mirrored ours too closely to dismiss. The letter mentioned men refusing night shifts, equipment found abandoned mid-task, and a body recovered with no external wounds, but extensive internal damage. And as I read those words, I felt the same pressure settle behind my eyes that I had felt in the basin, the unmistakable recognition of a pattern resuming after a long pause, as though whatever governed those woods had simply waited for conditions to align again. I traveled as far as I dared, not to intervene but to observe, and when I reached the edge of that new region I did not step inside the tree line, because age had taught me that understanding does not always require proximity, and from where I stood I could already feel the difference in the air, the way sound flattened, the way distance seemed compressed, the way the forest did not invite movement but tolerated it. Standing there alone, with nothing but memory and instinct to guide me, I found myself weighing a decision that felt eerily familiar, whether to retreat and preserve what remained of my peace, or to step closer and risk awakening something that did not need encouragement. And in that moment of uncertainty, I wondered what you would have done, whether you would have trusted the quiet warning in your chest or dismissed it as imagination. And if that question resonates with you, you can share your thoughts in the comments, because choices made in isolation often reveal more about us than the danger itself. I chose to leave. As I walked away, I did not feel chased or threatened, only acknowledged, and that distinction mattered more than I can explain, because it suggested that restraint was still in effect, that the boundary had been respected, and that whatever intelligence governed those places remained consistent in its expectations. That consistency, more than fear, convinced me that what we encountered was not fading with time, but persisting through it. In the years since that letter, I have paid closer attention to absence than presence, to places marked by sudden quiet rather than obvious catastrophe, because the lesson of the basin was not that danger announces itself, but that it often communicates through withdrawal, through the removal of normalcy so gradual that only those attuned to pattern notice when something essential has been subtracted. I have seen maps where certain regions resist development decade after decade, not for lack of resources or access, But because projects stall, permits lapse, workers refuse assignments without clear explanation, and when you overlay those regions with older reports, the alignment becomes difficult to ignore, forming corridors of persistence that stretch across time rather than space. What troubles me most is not the idea that something powerful inhabits those forests, but the implication that it understands restraint better than we do, that it knows precisely how much force is required to alter behavior without provoking retaliation, and that it relies on memory rather than dominance to maintain control. I think often of the men who did not leave with us, of the way their deaths were not chaotic or excessive, but measured, purposeful, and final, and I wonder whether their role was to serve as proof rather than punishment, evidence delivered just once, so the message would not need repetition. As I age, my certainty about what is possible has narrowed, but my certainty about what is present has widened, and I no longer find comfort in the idea that humanity occupies the top of every hierarchy, because the world feels less fragile and more structured when you accept that other systems of order exist alongside ours. I do not believe what we encountered seeks conflict, and I do not believe it desires recognition, because both require engagement, and engagement was never offered, only tolerance, extended conditionally and revoked without warning when its limits were tested. If there is hope in this story, it lies not in conquest or explanation, but in attention, in the ability to recognize when persistence becomes intrusion, and to step back before consequence becomes instruction. Some forests remain standing not because they are empty, but because they are governed, and those who listen closely enough are usually allowed to leave. I once believed that time would turn what we witnessed into folklore, that repetition and distance would erode its sharpness until it became harmless, a story told to fill silence rather than explain it. But as the decades passed, I came to understand that some experiences do not fade because they are not memories in the usual sense. They are recalibrations, moments that permanently adjust how the world presents itself afterward. I watched as younger men entered the timber trade with confidence and left it quietly, not broken but altered, speaking less about danger and more about atmosphere, about places that felt wrong long before anything happened, and I recognized in their careful language the same instinct we had developed, the ability to read absence as information rather than emptiness. What stayed with me most was not fear but clarity, because the basin taught me that dominance is not always loud, that control does not require constant enforcement, and that restraint is often the most convincing display of power. A lesson that extended beyond forests and into every system humans insist on mastering without first understanding. I stopped arguing when people dismissed accounts like ours, because disbelief does not negate presence, and in some cases it serves it, allowing boundaries to remain intact without challenge. And I began to see skepticism not as opposition but as insulation, a way for the world to protect itself from acknowledging structures that complicate its assumptions. There were moments when I wondered whether we had been spared intentionally, whether survival itself was part of the message, proof that compliance yields continuity, and although that thought unsettled me, it also offered a framework in which what happened made sense without becoming monstrous, an order rather than a threat. I returned once more, years later, to the outskirts of the region, not to investigate but to confirm something internal, and standing at the edge of the trees, I felt nothing press toward me, no warning, no invitation, only a neutrality that suggested the matter was closed, the boundary respected, the account settled. That neutrality felt final. It told me that the lesson had been learned, that no further demonstration was required, and that whatever governed those woods did not concern itself with belief, only with behavior, a distinction that clarified more than any explanation ever could. From that day on, I stopped searching for proof, because proof implies persuasion, and persuasion implies an audience that needs convincing, and what we encountered did not operate on that level. It simply existed, persistent and indifferent to interpretation. I am telling this story now, not because the danger continues unabated, but because the memory of restraint deserves preservation. Because in a world obsessed with escalation, it is easy to forget that some forces achieve their aims without excess, and that survival sometimes depends on recognizing when to withdraw rather than advance. Those men who died did not perish in chaos, and that distinction matters because chaos suggests loss of control. And what happened in that camp was anything but uncontrolled. It was precise, limited, and sufficient, a response calibrated to alter behavior without inviting retaliation. I carry their names with me not as victims but as witnesses, because their absence reshaped an entire region without leaving monuments or headlines, altering patterns quietly in a way that still persists if you know where to look. Installed developments, in rerouted plans, in places that remain inexplicably untouched. If you stayed with this account until now, know that attention itself is a form of respect, and that listening without demanding resolution allows certain truths to exist without distortion, which may be the only ethical way to hold them. I am grateful you did not rush past the quiet parts, because the quiet parts are where this story lives, not in spectacle but in the spaces where action could have happened and did not, where restraint speaks louder than violence ever could. There are other accounts like this one, scattered and incomplete, waiting not for belief but for patience. And if you choose to continue listening, to follow another story told with the same care, you may begin to notice patterns not meant to frighten but to orient. Reminders that the world is structured in more ways than we are taught to see. I leave you with this not as a warning, but as an invitation to move differently, to pay attention to the subtle shifts that precede consequence, and to trust the instinct that tells you when a place is not empty, even when it appears so. Some stories end because the danger is gone. Others end because the boundary held. And this one ends because we were allowed to leave.